In this video, I will briefly respond to Joe Schmid's aloneness argument against classical theism. I don't claim that my response is decisive or that others will necessarily find it agreeable. It's only representative of the way I respond to the argument. Furthermore, I recommend watching Joe's entire presentation of his argument, linked in the description. To start, Joe defines divine simplicity as the view that there is no metaphysical or physical composition in God, such that there is no distinction in God between substance and attribute, essence and existence, form and matter, act and potency, genius and differentia, agent and action, and essence and accident, and all of God's intrinsic features are identical not only to each other, but to God himself. Joe defines intrinsic features as features that characterize things in virtue of the way that things are, and defines extrinsic features as features that characterize things in virtue of their relation to other things. The aloneness argument then, as presented by Joe, goes like this. God could have been alone. Necessarily, God has contingent knowledge. This contingent knowledge is either wholly intrinsic, partly intrinsic and partly extrinsic, or wholly extrinsic. It can be neither partly intrinsic and partly extrinsic, or wholly extrinsic. Whatever is wholly intrinsic to God is either an essential feature or an accident. Whatever is contingent cannot be an essential feature of God. If classical theism is true, it's not possible for God to have accidents. Therefore, classical theism is false. I reject premise 4 of this argument. I think that God's knowledge can be partly intrinsic and partly extrinsic. The way I see this working is that the act of God's knowing is necessary and intrinsic, while the contingent content of God's knowledge is extrinsic to God. But Joe argues that awareness, beliefs, and desires would be intrinsic, and so God's awareness of the extrinsic contingent content, beliefs about it, and desires to respond to it would seem to be intrinsic and contingent. However, I think that the relation that God's awareness, beliefs, and desires have to the extrinsic contingent content is a contingent relation, but this contingent relation is not intrinsic to God. I recognize that one could have a different intuition about this because it would seem that contingent content would inform God and thereby change a feature of God's mind, rendering that intrinsic feature of God's mind contingent. But I'm not convinced that that conclusion follows. Certainly God responds to the extrinsic contingent content, but I don't know that this requires God's mind to have an intrinsic contingent feature that changes. Yet there is then the concern that the extrinsic contingent content would then be Platonic in nature, which could pose a problem for classical theism. Yet I don't think that the extrinsic contingent content would be Platonic. I think contingent content is simply the causal input that is transferred between various situations. For example, if the sun rises, my mind can become informed of that event, but I don't think that there is some Platonic object out there grounding the fact that the sun is rising. It's simply an event that takes place that my mind can be aware of. So I don't see why extrinsic contingent content would have to be Platonic. Furthermore, I would argue that classical theism only requires that God is the fount of all concrete being. But since Platonic objects consist of abstractions and not concrete being, God does not necessarily need to be the cause of Platonic abstractions. Joe, though, argues, that if there is Platonic content, then God's knowing of that content would be distinct from God's causing, because God would not be the cause of the Platonic content, which would then represent a distinction in God between God's act of knowing and God's act of causing. However, I don't agree with classical theists who argue that God's knowing and causing have to be the same action, because I think it's coherent for God to know extrinsic contingent events like human free choices, but that God does not determine human free choices. I don't think actions are real features. They are simply conceptually distinct things that God does. So God's knowing and causing being distinct to me does not seem to indicate any distinction within God. More can be said about all of this, and again, I don't claim my response is decisive or that Joe or anyone else will be persuaded by it. It's also possible that I missed something crucial in Joe's argument. So again, I recommend watching his video, but hopefully my position is clear, which is that I'm skeptical of premise 4 of the aloneness argument because I think God's knowledge can be partly intrinsic and partly extrinsic because God's act of knowing is intrinsic, but the contingent content that is known can be extrinsic to God. Thanks for watching.